What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected voices gets silenced on live television? In just 26 seconds, a single comment would turn a routine interview into an explosion that nobody saw coming. Morgan Freeman sat across from the panel of The View, his calm presence a stark contrast to the energy buzzing through the studio. He was there to discuss his latest project, a documentary about unity and understanding in divided times. The audience applauded warmly as he took his seat, their excitement palpable. This was Morgan Freeman, after all, a legend, an icon, someone whose voice had narrated countless stories, whose presence commanded respect wherever he went. Whoopi Goldberg introduced him, but there was something in her tone that felt off, something sharp. The smile on her face seemed forced, like she was going through the motions, but her mind was already somewhere else, already preparing for something. "So, Morgan," Whoopi began, leaning forward with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You've made this whole documentary about bringing people together. That's interesting coming from someone in your position." Morgan nodded politely. "Yes, I believe we need more conversations and less confrontation in this country." "Conversations," Whoopi repeated, her voice dripping with skepticism. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "That's easy to say when you've lived the life you've lived, when you've had the privileges you've had, when you get to sit in your mansion and tell the rest of us how to feel." The audience let out a collective gasp. This wasn't the playful banter they were used to. This felt personal, pointed. The other panelists shifted in their seats. Joy Behar glanced at Sunny Hostin, eyebrows raised, her expression clearly saying, "Where is this going?" Even they seemed surprised by the immediate edge in Whoopi's voice. This wasn't the interview they'd prepared for. Morgan kept his composure, though his eyes flickered with something. Surprise, maybe, or disappointment. "I've worked for everything I have. I grew up in Mississippi, lived in poverty, and earned my way through this industry one role at a time. Nothing was handed to me." "Oh, please," Whoopi cut him off, waving her hand dismissively. The gesture was almost theatrical in its contempt. "You're going to sit here and act like you haven't benefited from just being who you are? Being the voice that Hollywood loves to use when they want to seem deep? When they want to seem like they care about important things without actually doing anything about them?" Morgan's eyes narrowed slightly. "That's quite an assumption to make about my entire body of work and my life." "It's not an assumption," Whoopi countered. "It's an observation, based on decades of watching you position yourself as this wise elder statesman while never actually taking a real stand on anything that matters." The audience went silent. You could hear someone cough in the back row. "Whoopi," Ana Navarro interjected carefully, "I think what Morgan is trying to say is—" "I know what he's trying to say," Whoopi snapped, not even looking at Ana. Her eyes stayed locked on Morgan. "I've heard this speech before. This whole 'we need to come together' thing. It's patronizing." Morgan's jaw tightened slightly, the first sign that her words were landing. His fingers drummed once on the armrest of his chair before he stilled them. "I don't think asking for dialogue is patronizing. I think it's necessary. I think it's the only way forward." "Necessary for who?" Whoopi shot back, her voice rising with each word. "Necessary for people who want everyone to just be quiet and accept things as they are? Necessary for people who've already got theirs and don't want the boat rocked? Is that what your documentary is really about? Keeping people calm so nothing actually changes?" The production crew behind the cameras exchanged nervous glances. This was spiraling fast. The segment producer touched her earpiece, listening to instructions from the control room, but there was nothing they could do. This was live television. Joy tried to intervene. "I think we should actually talk about what's in the film before we—" "I'm talking about what's in the film." Whoopi interrupted again, her voice rising. I'm talking about this idea that we all just need to hold hands and sing songs while the world burns around us. That's what I'm hearing. Morgan leaned back in his chair, taking a slow breath. You haven't seen the film. Excuse me? Whoopi's eyes went wide. You haven't seen the documentary, Morgan repeated, his voice steady but firm. So you're not actually talking about what's in it. You're talking about what you've decided it must be about. The tension in the studio became almost physical. Sunny Hostin looked like she wanted to crawl under the table. Alyssa Farah Griffin sat frozen, her coffee cup halfway to her mouth. Whoopi let out a sharp laugh. Oh, so now you're going to tell me what I have and haven't seen? That's rich. That's really rich coming from you. I'm simply stating a fact, Morgan said. The film hasn't been released yet. You couldn't have seen it. I've seen enough, Whoopi fired back. I've seen the interviews you've done. I've heard what you've said about politics, about movements, about people fighting for change. And frankly, it's disappointing. What's disappointing? Morgan asked, his voice still remarkably calm. You are, Whoopi said bluntly. You sit here with this voice that everyone respects, this presence, and you use it to tell people to basically calm down, to stop being so angry, to stop demanding change. I have never said that, Morgan replied, his tone hardening just slightly. You don't have to say it directly, Whoopi continued, leaning forward aggressively. It's in everything you do. This documentary is just another example. Another celebrity telling regular people how they should feel. Anna tried again. Whoopi, maybe we should let Morgan explain what the documentary actually... I don't need him to explain anything. Whoopi cut her off. I can see it for what it is. Morgan's expression remained composed, but something had shifted in his eyes. You've made up your mind about me, about my work, about my intentions, all without actually engaging with any of it. I engage with your work every time you speak publicly, Whoopi said, and every time it's the same message. Stay quiet. Don't rock the boat. Be grateful for what you have. That is absolutely not my message, Morgan said, his voice rising for the first time. My message is that change comes through understanding, not through division. Whoopi laughed again, but there was no humor in it. Understanding, there it is. The magic word that means absolutely nothing. You want people who are suffering to understand their oppressors. Is that it? The audience gasped. Joy's mouth fell open. That's not what I said, Morgan responded, his calm cracking. And that's an incredibly unfair characterization of... Is it though? Whoopi interrupted. Because that's what it sounds like to me. It sounds like you want everyone to just get along while ignoring the very real problems that exist. I have never ignored problems, Morgan said firmly. I've spent my entire career highlighting them. In movies, Whoopi scoffed, her voice dripping with disdain. In pretend scenarios where everything wraps up nicely in 2 hours, where the good guy wins and everyone learns a lesson. Real life doesn't work that way, Morgan. Real change doesn't happen because people sit around a table and have nice conversations. Real change requires disruption. It requires making people uncomfortable. It requires conflict. I never said change was comfortable, Morgan responded. But I do believe it requires more than just anger and division. It requires building something, not just tearing things down. There you go again, Whoopi said, shaking her head. With your both sides rhetoric, like there are always two equally valid perspectives on everything. Some things don't have two sides, Morgan. Some things are just right and wrong. Sunny finally found her voice. I think there's value in both approaches. Conversation and action can coexist. Nobody asked you, Whoopi snapped at Sunny, who looked genuinely hurt. Morgan's expression shifted. Watching someone else get attacked seemed to affect him more than the attacks on himself. There's no need to speak to her that way. I'll speak however I want, Whoopi said, turning back to him with fire in her eyes. This is my show. My table. My rules. And if I think someone needs to be called out, I'll call them out. I don't care who they are, or how famous they think they are. Morgan's expression shifted. Noticeably, his eyebrows drew together. His lips pressed into a thin line. Watching someone else get attacked seemed to affect him more than the attacks on himself had. There was something about seeing Sunny, who'd only tried to mediate, get shut down so harshly that seemed to crystallize something for him. There's no need to speak to her that way. She was trying to help. I said you're treating this like an interrogation instead of an interview, Morgan replied, his voice measured. You invited me here to discuss my work, but you've done nothing but attack me personally since I sat down. Attack you? Whoopi's voice went up an octave. You think this is an attack? You have no idea what a real attack looks like. I know what disrespect looks like, Morgan said calmly, and I'm watching it right now. Joy tried to lighten the mood. Okay, let's everyone just take a breath here. Don't tell me to take a breath, Whoopi shot at Joy, who immediately went quiet. Morgan stood up slowly, his movements measured and deliberate. He reached for the microphone pack at his waist, his fingers working the clip with practiced ease. The studio seemed to hold its breath. Everyone understood what was happening. This wasn't a momentary frustration. This was a decision. A line being drawn. The camera operators instinctively tightened their shots, capturing every detail of this unprecedented moment. In all the years The View had been on the air, through countless controversial interviews and heated debates, nothing quite like this had happened before. What are you doing? Whoopi demanded, and for the first time, there was something other than anger in her voice. Uncertainty, maybe. The realization that she'd pushed too far. I'm leaving, Morgan said simply, unclipping the mic. You can't just leave in the middle of the show, Whoopi said, but her voice had changed. There was something almost panicked in it now. I can, and I am, Morgan replied. I came here in good faith to have a conversation, but you're not interested in conversation. You're interested in making me a villain for your narrative. Sit down, Whoopi ordered. We're not done here. Yes, we are, Morgan said, placing the microphone on his chair. I don't stay in places where I'm not respected. Anna spoke up, her voice gentle but firm. Morgan, please, I'd really like to hear about the documentary, about what inspired you to make it, about the people you interviewed and the stories you uncovered. Morgan looked at Anna, and his expression softened considerably. Here was someone actually interested in the work, someone asking a real question instead of launching an attack. I appreciate that, Anna, truly, but I won't sit here and be berated for trying to do something positive. I won't be used as a target for someone's anger about things that have nothing to do with me or my work. Positive, Whoopi laughed bitterly. You think you're doing something positive by telling people to essentially shut up and accept things? I have never told anyone to shut up, Morgan said, his voice sharp now. I have never told anyone to accept injustice. What I have said, consistently, is that we need to find common ground if we want to create lasting change. That's not controversial. That's common sense. Common sense, Whoopi repeated mockingly. That's what people say when they want to dismiss legitimate anger and frustration. Morgan shook his head slowly. You're determined to misunderstand me, to paint me as something I'm not, and I won't participate in that. Then leave, Whoopi said coldly. If you can't handle a real conversation, leave. This isn't a conversation, Morgan said, his voice quiet but powerful. A conversation requires two people willing to listen to each other. You haven't listened to a single word I've said. You decided who I was before I even walked through that door. Sunny spoke up again, braver this time. Morgan has a point, Whoopi. We did invite him here to discuss his work, and we haven't really let him... Not now, Sunny. Whoopi cut her off again. Morgan looked around at the other panelists. You all just sit here and let her do this? Attack guests? Attack each other? Joy looked uncomfortable. It's complicated. It's not complicated, Morgan said. It's a choice, and I'm making mine. He turned to walk off the set. The cameras followed him. You're really going to walk out? Whoopi called after him. You're going to prove that you can't handle criticism? Morgan stopped and turned back. Criticism would require you to have actually engaged with my work. What you've done is attack my character based on assumptions. There's a difference. I've engaged plenty, Whoopi insisted. No, Morgan said firmly. You've projected. You've decided what you think I believe, and you've attacked that version of me. But that version doesn't exist. So you're the victim now? Whoopi asked sarcastically. I'm not claiming to be a victim, Morgan replied. I'm simply refusing to be your punching bag. The audience began to murmur. Some people were clearly uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. You know what your problem is? Whoopi said, standing up now. You're so used to everyone treating you like you're special. Like your voice matters more than everyone else's. So when someone challenges you, you can't handle it. Your problem, Morgan said, his voice still controlled, is that you think challenging someone means disrespecting them. Those aren't the same thing. Don't you dare tell me what my problem is, Whoopi said, her voice shaking with anger now. Then don't tell me what mine is, Morgan shot back. They stared at each other for a long moment. The entire studio seemed to hold its breath. I've had enough of this, Morgan said finally. I came here to talk about hope. About finding ways to bridge divides. And instead, I've been lectured about how wrong I am for even trying. Maybe you are wrong, Whoopi said. Maybe, Morgan acknowledged. But I'd rather be wrong while trying to bring people together than right while tearing them apart. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Whoopi's expression hardened. Get out of my studio. Gladly, Morgan said. He walked toward the exit. The cameras stayed on him the entire way. His posture was straight, dignified. He didn't rush. He didn't look back. Joy tried one last time. Morgan, please, can we just start over? He paused at the edge of the set, considering. Then he shook his head. Some things can't be started over. They can only be ended. And with that, he walked off. The cameras cut back to the panel. Whoopi was still standing, her chest heaving. The other hosts looked shell-shocked. Nobody seemed to know what to say. Anna finally broke the silence. Well, that was... Don't, Whoopi cut her off. Just don't. The show went to commercial break, but the damage was done. What was supposed to be a simple interview about a documentary had turned into something else entirely. A confrontation that nobody expected. A moment that would be talked about for days, weeks, months to come. Because what happened in those few minutes wasn't just about Morgan Freeman or Whoopi Goldberg. It was about respect. About how we treat people who see things differently than we do. About the difference between challenging ideas and attacking people. Morgan had come to talk about unity. Instead, he'd been met with hostility. He'd been dismissed, interrupted, mocked. His intentions had been questioned. His character had been attacked. And through it all, he'd maintained his dignity. He'd stayed calm when others might have shouted. He'd stayed measured when others might have lashed out. And in the end, he'd made a choice. A choice that spoke louder than any words could. He chose to walk away rather than participate in something that had stopped being productive. He chose self-respect over television time. He chose dignity over defending himself against baseless accusations. The other panelists sat in silence as the commercial break continued. They knew what had just happened. They knew it hadn't been right, but nobody had stopped it. Nobody had stood up strongly enough to say this wasn't okay. They'd watched it unfold, made weak attempts to intervene, then retreated when they were shut down. Joy finally spoke. That got out of hand. Whoopi didn't respond. She was staring at the spot where Morgan had been sitting. We should have let him talk about the documentary, Sonny said quietly. He could have stayed, Whoopi said defensively. Could he, though? Anna asked. Really? Whoopi turned to her. What's that supposed to mean? It means you didn't give him much choice, Anna said, more boldly than before. You attacked him from the moment he sat down. I challenged him, Whoopi corrected. No, Joy said, shaking her head. Anna's right. That wasn't a challenge. That was an attack. Whoopi looked around at her co-hosts. You're all taking his side? There shouldn't be sides, Sunny said. That's the whole point. He walked out on us, Whoopi said, on live television. After you told him to get out of your studio, Anna reminded her. The tension among the panel was now almost as thick as it had been with Morgan. The cameras would be back on them in seconds, and they all knew they had to pull it together. But the cracks had formed. What had been revealed couldn't be hidden again. When they came back from commercial, Whoopi's demeanor had changed. She was more subdued, but she didn't apologize. She didn't acknowledge what had happened. She simply moved on to the next segment as if one of Hollywood's most respected actors hadn't just walked off her show. But everyone watching knew. They'd seen it unfold in real time. They'd watched a man come to share something meaningful and be met with contempt. They'd watched him try to explain himself only to be interrupted and dismissed. They'd watched him show more grace under pressure than most people could manage. And they'd watched him make a decision that took courage. Because walking away isn't always easy, especially when cameras are rolling, especially when, people will talk, especially when it might be seen as weakness by some. But Morgan Freeman didn't walk away because he was weak. He walked away because he was strong enough to know when a situation was beyond saving. Strong enough to value his own dignity over getting the last word. Strong enough to demonstrate, through his actions, the very principles he'd been trying to discuss. He'd wanted to talk about bridging divides. Instead, he'd shown what happens when one side isn't interested in building bridges, when one side is only interested in being right, in attacking, in tearing down. The show continued. Other guests came on. Other topics were discussed. But that moment lingered. It colored everything that came after. Because once you've seen someone treated that way, once you've watched respect disappear and hostility take its place, it's hard to pretend everything is normal. The other hosts tried to engage with the rest of the show, but their hearts weren't in it. They kept glancing at each other, at Whoopi, at the empty chair where Morgan had been sitting. They were all thinking the same thing, even if none of them said it out loud. This didn't have to happen. It could have been a conversation, a real one, about ideas, about approaches, about how we create change in a divided world. It could have been productive, enlightening, the kind of television that actually matters. Instead, it became an example of everything Morgan had been warning against. Division, hostility, the refusal to listen, the assumption that anyone who disagrees with you must have bad intentions. Whoopi had accused Morgan of telling people to be quiet, to accept things, to stop fighting for change, but she'd never let him actually explain his position. She'd never asked genuine questions. She'd never given him the space to share what was actually in his documentary, what had actually inspired him to make it. She'd decided what he thought, what he believed, what he represented, and then she'd attacked that version of him, the version she'd created in her own mind. And when he'd pushed back, when he'd defended himself, when he'd pointed out that she wasn't actually engaging with him, but with her assumptions about him, she'd gotten angrier, because she didn't want to be challenged. She wanted to be right. The irony was thick. In a segment about a documentary focused on unity and dialogue, there had been no unity, no dialogue, just confrontation, just accusations, just one person talking at another rather than with them. Morgan had handled it with remarkable restraint. Lesser people would have shouted, would have matched her energy, would have turned it into a screaming match. But he'd stayed calm, stayed measured. Even when his frustration showed, he kept it controlled. He'd tried reason. He'd tried explanation. He'd tried pointing out the unfairness of what was happening. And when none of that worked, when it became clear that nothing he said would matter because she'd already made up her mind, he'd done the only thing left to do. He'd left. Not in anger. Not with a dramatic storming off. Just a quiet, dignified exit. A statement through action rather than words. And that exit said everything. It said, I value myself too much to stay where I'm not respected. It said, I won't participate in my own degradation. It said there are limits to what I'll tolerate, and you've crossed them. It was powerful precisely because it was understated. Because he didn't need to make a scene. The scene had already been made. All he had to do was remove himself from it. As the show wound down, as they said their goodbyes to the camera and thanked the audience for watching, there was an awkwardness that couldn't be hidden. Smiles that didn't quite land. Energy that felt forced. The sense that something had gone very wrong and everyone knew it. When the cameras finally stopped rolling, when the audience filed out and the studio lights dimmed, the host sat in silence for a moment. We need to talk about what happened, Joy said. Not now, Whoopi replied, gathering her things. Then when? Anna pressed. Whoopi didn't answer. She just walked off the set, leaving her co-hosts sitting there, looking at each other with expressions that said everything words couldn't. They knew this would follow them. This moment. This interview that became a confrontation. This display of hostility towards someone who'd come in peace. They knew people would talk about it, analyze it, take sides over it, and deep down, they knew which side most people would take. Because regardless of how you felt about Morgan Freeman's views, regardless of whether you agreed with his approach to social change, there was no denying how he'd been treated. There was no justifying it. He'd been disrespected. Repeatedly. Intentionally. And he'd responded with more grace than most people could manage. That was the story people would remember. Not what was said, but how it was said. Not the arguments made, but the way those arguments were delivered. The View had hosted thousands of guests over the years. Some interviews were memorable. Some were forgettable. But this one would stand out. Not because of anything Morgan Freeman did, but because of what was done to him, and because of how he responded. He'd shown that sometimes the most powerful response isn't to fight back. It's to refuse to participate. To say, without raising your voice, this isn't acceptable and I won't be part of it. That's what happened when one of Hollywood's most respected voices sat down for what should have been a simple interview. That's what happened when respect disappeared and hostility took over. That's what happened when someone decided they'd rather attack than understand. And that's what happened when a man decided his dignity was worth more than airtime. The empty chair sat there under the studio lights, a silent reminder of what had unfolded, of what had been lost, of the conversation that could have been but never was. Because in the end, that's what this was about. A lost opportunity. A chance to actually discuss ideas, to explore different perspectives, to model the kind of dialogue that could help heal divisions. All of it wasted because one person couldn't see past their own assumptions. Morgan Freeman had wanted to talk about bringing people together. Instead, he'd been pushed away. The metaphor was almost too perfect, too on the nose, but it was real. It happened, and everyone who watched it knew exactly what they'd seen. They'd seen what happens when certainty replaces curiosity, when judgment replaces understanding, when attacking becomes more important than listening, and they'd seen what it looks like when someone refuses to accept that as normal. When someone says, no, this isn't right, and I won't pretend it is. That quiet refusal, that dignified exit, that choice to value self-respect over everything else. That was the real story. That was what would be remembered.